Welcome to the Breakthrough and Thrive Summit, where you have the opportunity to ignite your power, take charge of your healing, and create happiness after experiencing sexual abuse and trauma. I am your host, Jamie Lynn, and today I'm giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Shah, who is an expert on probiotics and making sure that your gut health is spectacular so you can live the life of your dreams. Would you like to add anything to that?
Well, let me begin by just introducing myself to your audience. So I am a board-certified internist by training. I have been practicing as an internist for nearly 2 decades. And in the last 5 years, I have, because of emerging science, really developed a keen passion for gut health viewed through the lens of the gut microbiota. That's the trillions of bacteria that exist in our gut, and we're discovering that they have huge implications for human health in a variety of spheres, including the consequences of stress-related events like sexual trauma, and how that can affect the gut microbiota, and how we can thoughtfully manipulate the gut microbiota to perhaps improve mood disorders like anxiety and depression, some of which may be the consequence of unfortunate sexual trauma.
I think that statement right there brings a lot of hope to many of us.
Well, I'm delighted to do what I can. I'm not a psychiatrist, and I don't have a tremendous amount of experience working with the survivors of such trauma, but I can certainly make available in this conference call today some of the information that I know of and that I've studied with regards to ways that we could perhaps combat them, and combat them outside of the typical pharmaceutical kind of hamster wheel that a lot of patients end up on.
Yeah, I mean, in my personal experience, the side effects from the pills alone can cause a lot more damage and problems just in daily living. So any alternative, I think, is warmly welcomed. So,
well, you're absolutely right about that. You know, I've always struggled as a provider and as a prescriber, prescribing drugs that the pharmaceutical industry has developed and marketed to both patients and doctors alike to treat mood disorders like anxiety and depression. And let's just take, for example, the SSRIs. The prototypical one is Prozac. More recent iterations are ones like Lexapro, Zoloft, Celexa. These drugs are in a class that we were told initially all that they do is they raise the levels of serotonin in the brain. And serotonin is generally regarded as a feel-good neurotransmitter. So the theory is the more of it that you have in the brain, the less likely you are to suffer anxiety or depression.
Serotonin is naturally occurring in our bodies, right?
Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that occurs naturally both in the brain, but there's a tiny fraction of it that actually exists in the brain, about 10%.
Okay.
The other 90%, believe it or not, exists within our gut. And
Wow.
We'll get into that a little bit. But getting back to the SSRIs, I wanted to complete that loop. These are drugs that are extremely powerful. In many ways, they are chemically addictive. Getting off of them after a patient's been on them for a while can be a real challenge. And they have really significant side effects, well documented in the literature. For example, sexual dysfunction and weight gain. So I always found it kind of an enigma and a conundrum to tell a patient, you know, you're no longer depressed or you're no longer anxious, but oh, by the way, you no longer can have an orgasm and you've gained 20 pounds. It seemed to be an odd sort of bargain to make with my patients that had such mood disorders. So over the years, I became less and less a fan of that class in particular.
Well, thank you for elaborating on that. Like I said, my personal experience actually stems from watching my mom go up and down with being prescribed those types of pills. And I've seen the danger that it causes, you know, and, you know, if you gain that 20 pounds, you could chance falling into depression again.
Yeah, it can become a vicious cycle. And particularly in a culture that so heavily emphasizes body image.
Yeah.
It's difficult. You're dealing with a patient population that may be vulnerable to begin with, that may be fragile to begin with. And that's why A lot of the research that's coming out about gut health is very exciting for me because it's an opportunity for me as well as my patients to get off of that hamster wheel that pharmaceutical industries have created. You know, one of the problems with modern healthcare in America is that it is primarily driven by pharmaceutical companies. And when I say that, I don't mean in some sort of evil conspiracy. They just have money. They have the money to conduct research. They have the money to inform research positions at universities. They have the money to conduct clinical trials in a variety of centers. And as a result of that, truth as an idea or concept begins to be entirely appropriated by the pharmaceutical industry. Well, the problem with that is that the pharmaceutical industry is a profit-driven corporate entity. And so at the end of the day, what they want is for a doctor to be the end dispenser, a PES dispenser, if you will, for their products. And so we're trained from very early on in medical school and then in residency to look for signs and symptoms that correlate with a certain drug. And then to prescribe that drug to the patient, and that is considered healing. And one of the problems with modern healthcare is that in order for doctors to remain fiscally solvent, they have to see 4 to 6 patients an hour. That limits the amount of time that a doctor can spend with a patient, sometimes down to 7 to 10 minutes. So it becomes a very seductive thing to say, you know what, in those 7 to 10 minutes, I'm not going to be able to have a deep, in-depth conversation with my patient. I'm not going to be able to educate my patient. Why not at least have some sort of gesture therapy in saying, hey, at least I gave you a pill, I gave you a medication, and it will chemically alter your brain enough to where you'll feel better. And I'll call that healing.
Yeah.
And I guess one of my lines in the sand is that I refuse to continue calling that healing.
Thank you. I mean, that's absolutely awesome. My one personal experience with caving into a prescription was actually for high blood pressure. And I'm not at a place where I can say that my blood pressure is fantastic, but I'm at a place where I can say I don't want to do that again. I took it for 3 weeks. I felt like I never needed a drop of coffee. It was great. I had all this energy. My mood was better because my energy was better. And then I found myself in the 4th week not being able to get off the couch. I couldn't take care of my kids. And then, the doctor's like, well, let's try something else. And I'm like, yeah, like not pills. They just don't work with my body. And, it's a scary thought because I still have to work on that and I have to figure that out. But
yeah, and I want to be clear about something, which is that I'm by no means a doctor that condemns categorically pharmaceuticals.
Okay.
And I think that there's a number of clinical applications for pharmaceuticals that make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I do agree.
If somebody has severe dyslipidemia, cholesterol that is so dangerously high and clearly genetic as opposed to lifestyle-based,
Okay.
the best thing for that patient is to go on a medication that will lower their lipid levels, because we know that by doing that, we're going to substantially reduce their risk of a heart attack or stroke. And frankly, with blood pressure, again, whether you choose a pharmaceutical agent or you do it through lifestyle modifications, we know that high blood pressure, untreated, uncontrolled, will go on to cause a lot of catastrophic events. The leading cause of congestive heart failure in America is not a heart attack. It is long-standing uncontrolled hypertension. So there are times and places where pharmaceuticals, I think, are entirely appropriate, and I prescribe them. But with regards to mood disorder, I think that there has been such hype without an objective way to assess outcomes and to see whether or not there's actual improvement or not, that I think it really challenges clinicians and patients to look at it somewhat more skeptically.
Okay.
And to think about it more critically. And so let me now, if I could, lay for you the table, set the table for the gut microbiota and how they may play a role in mood disorders like anxiety and depression, and then how we can meaningfully impact a patient's gut microbiota to achieve outcomes that could be decreased anxiety, decreased depression. To do that, you have to begin with a very basic understanding of what are the gut microbiota, how do they connect to our brain. And there's a lot of misinformation out there. I was on Instagram the other day reading the posts of another person who is a lay person, but who has an interest in gut health. And she posted that, 80 to 90% of the serotonin that's made in your body is made in your gut. So we've got to get your gut to make more serotonin because that's how your brain gets the serotonin. Okay. And that is not actually clinically true. So we'll get to the serotonin in a bit, but let me lay down sort of the basic anatomy of what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a brain, which obviously we house in our skull, and then we're dealing with our gut. And our gut is very unique as organs go in the body because it has its own nervous system. In fact, a lot of people call it your second brain. And that nervous system is called the enteric nervous system, and it consists of 500 million neurons strong. Just to put that in perspective, the spine contains about 100 million neurons. So you're talking about a neurologic structure that is 5 times more complex than the human spine, and that's the nervous system that lines your gut from your mouth basically all the way to the anus. Now, we have trillions of bacteria that reside in the gut. Some experts estimate the bacteria to weigh literally 3 pounds, which is a very ironic weight to give to the amount of bacteria in our gut, because that's also roughly what an average human brain weighs. Now, there is a connection between these two systems, the brain and the enteric nervous system that lines the gut. And that connection is, think of it as a cable. It's the vagus nerve. This is a nerve that is a two-way highway. So there's traffic going in both directions. When I was in medical school about a quarter of a century ago, we were taught that most of the traffic goes from the brain to the gut. But more recent research suggests quite the contrary, that actually the vagus nerve, this huge cable that connects the brain to the gut, that it is carrying more data from the gut to the brain than the brain is sending to the gut.
Wow.
Now that becomes very important as we begin to think about what it is that gut bacteria do. So gut microbiota, that's what they're referred to in a technical sense, but gut bacteria. All of us that are taking probiotics, whether we understand it fully or not, what we're trying to do is modify our gut microbiota. We're trying to introduce, as the name implies, good bacteria, probiotics, into that milieu, into that ecosystem, hoping to achieve certain health benefits. For the purposes of our conversation today, I'm going to limit my remarks to those manipulations that would affect anxiety and depression. So we have done animal studies that have made certain things very clear. And that is this, is that gut bacteria have a profound role in impacting our mental state. Our proclivities to develop anxiety or depression in many ways may be mediated by gut bacteria. So how does that happen? Well, there are a number of neurotransmitters that are manufactured in the gut as well as in the brain. And this is a very interesting kind of mirror effect. But in the gut, as I've already stated previously, 80 to 90% of the entire serotonin in your body is actually made in the gut. So is the majority of the dopamine that's manufactured in the body. It's manufactured in the gut. Now, what is dopamine? Dopamine is what I call the neurotransmitter of desire. Whether you desire food, whether you desire sex, whether you desire Facebook likes or Instagram views, those sort of things are all driven by our need for dopamine. Dopamine satisfies our desire. So think of serotonin as your feel-good, stabilizing kind of mood neurotransmitter, and dopamine as the little treat that you get when you've done something that gives you a lot of satisfaction.
Okay.
Well, both of these neurotransmitters are made in rich abundance in the gut. But here's where things get really fascinating. Let's talk about serotonin in particular. Serotonin is manufactured by a cell that lines our gut lining called the enterochromaffin cell. But what we've discovered is that enterochromaffin cells don't manufacture serotonin in a vacuum. they manufacture it in a very close, intimate relationship with certain species of bacteria.
Okay.
If those bacteria are in our gut, the gut makes more serotonin. If those bacteria are missing, then these enterochromaffin cells make less serotonin. Okay. But how does this impact the brain, right? I've heard people, as I've stated earlier, say, oh, well, the serotonin that's made in the gut somehow ends up in the brain, and that's how we feel better. And that is not true. What is true, however, is that that cable that I've talked about, the vagus nerve that connects the brain to the gut, well, it takes that information about how much serotonin is being made in the gut. It sends that signal to the brain, and the brain begins to mirror the amount of serotonin manufactured in the gut is how much the brain makes. So this is really fascinating. So we can actually begin to help adjust mood by adjusting the levels of serotonin in the brain, relying on the vagus nerve to carry that signal to the brain, where the brain will, in an effort to mimic the enteric nervous system, that's the nervous system that lines the gut, it will similarly match the levels of serotonin by upping the production.
Wow.
So a study was done using animal models in which they compared the effects of citalopram, which is one of those SSRIs that we talked about. It's in the same family as Prozac, as Zoloft. They compared the effects of that compared to a certain species of bacteria in the Bifidarium family. It was Bifidarium infantis. That species was given to animal models. Basically, these are studies involving rats. And they were able to achieve comparable rates of mitigation of anxiety and depression using Bifidarium infantis as opposed to citalopram. Now, that should be a real siren for anyone that suffers from anxiety and depression to say, well, wait a minute. All along, I've been told citalopram or one of its cousins is the way to go. And you're now telling me that there's a species of bacteria, one species that alone could impact my mood? And the answer is yes. Well, why aren't we hearing more about that? I'll tell you why. Because citalopram is $1 billion drug. That's a billion with a B. That's how much money it makes annually for its manufacturer. And probiotics are never going to touch that kind of revenue generation. And so because it doesn't generate revenue, it doesn't get the press, it doesn't get the push, it doesn't get the quote unquote science behind it in order to get people to buy into it. Now, there are other ways that mood and stress management can be affected by gut bacteria. So gut bacteria produce a variety of neuroendocrine substances, and I'll get into what those are. But these are ways that gut bacteria modulate our stress response. So typically our stress response to life events, sexual trauma being obviously a very unfortunate one, but a lot of our stress response to that is mediated by something called the HPA axis. That's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, okay? And the ultimate consequence of that is the production of stress hormones like cortisol. We know that there are manufactured substances made by gut microbiota that cross the blood barrier, cross the lining of the gut, go into our system, and actually lower our production of cortisol by softening and dampening the HPA axis's response to stress. Okay. I'm specifically talking about short-chain fatty acids. And short-chain fatty acids, amongst them, the most specific one is one called butyric acid. That production can lower our response to stress. Now, short-chain fatty acids are the byproduct of the metabolism of plant-based oligosaccharides that the bacteria digest. What's interesting is that these oligosaccharides, this is generally what we refer to as cellulose. This is indigestible for humans. But the reason why it's important to consume plant-based food is because of this reason, is that while we may not be able to digest it, the gut bacteria that reside in our gut, in our colon in particular, they can digest it. And not only do they digest it, but they turn it into really incredibly important endocrine-like substances that can modulate our response to stress.
And what are some of the foods that have the most of that in it?
Well, we're talking basically now about plants.
Okay.
So eating raw vegetables as unprocessed as possible is actually not just good fiber. A lot of people have naive views about it. Well, there's vitamins in there, and that's why I'm eating it. Probably the most important thing that you get out of eating a plant-based diet that consists of a lot of fiber is that you're giving your bacteria the perfect substrate to manufacture these incredibly powerful anti-inflammatory agents known as short-chain fatty acids.
And now I noticed that you said raw. So is there something that happens to the food that when we cook it that isn't as effective as eating it raw?
Well, with respect to fiber, I'm not certain if that's the case, but take, for example, potatoes, okay? The only part of the potato that there's a lot of fiber is in the skin.
Right.
But a lot of the ways that modern Americans eat potatoes has nothing to do with skin. We're really focused on the carbohydrate that's found within it. And so we mash it, we boil it, and we consume it in that way, or we turn it into French fries that have no fiber, but have all the carbs. So modern Western civilization through roughly around 1950 is when we first began to process our food. That's when we industrialized our food. And what we did when we industrialized food as a generalization is that we robbed that food of its fiber content and its nutritional value. And by and large, we replaced all of that with three things. We replaced it with fat, sugar, and salt.
That's where we get the flavor that we seem to be craving.
Yeah, and you know, that's a very complicated question as well. What are our cravings? I'll tell you this, young lady, that the cravings that we experience may have as much to do with what resides in our gut as much as our own impulses. Mm-hmm. So that's another whole area of the gut microbiota that is certainly a conversation worth having. But let me get back to the topic at hand a little bit and share this with you, is that the gut microbiota that exists in the human gut not only influence human behavior, influence human mood, influence levels of inflammation, but again, it's a two-way street. Elevated levels of stress, psychic trauma, sexual trauma, it can have a profound impact on what it is that actually lives in your gut. So this is kind of mind-blowing, is that your life experiences may very well dictate what takes up residence in your gut. And one of the ways to treat a patient, in my opinion, who has suffered extraordinary levels of stress, who's gone through an experience that has changed the way that they manage their stress, the way that their HPA axis manufactures stress hormones, and now has changed the gut microbiota, changed the ecology of it. One of the ways that I think is a really novel, interesting way that that patient may get some help, that human may get some help, is to have someone work with them to change their gut microbiota back to what it was prior to this insult, prior to that event, and to see if that lowers anxiety, that lowers depression, and lowers some of the stress that's associated or triggered by that event.
That would be amazing.
Yeah. So it's again, it's not something that I have a lot of experience in because as an internist, I deal with a variety of conditions that I'm helping through modulating the gut microbiota. I will tell you this, that about a third of an average internist's practice is dedicated to the treatment of anxiety and depression. So I'm by no means any stranger to seeing anxiety and depression in my patients. My patient base has always been relatively young. I'm not a geriatrician, so I deal with a lot of young working people such as you, and I have seen quite a bit of a variety of traumas that can occur, psychic traumas that can occur in life. And I can tell you that without a doubt, your gut microbiota, modulating your gut microbiota are very serious things that should be entertained by someone who's had such an experience.
And all we gotta do is eat raw vegetables.
Well, raw vegetables are a start, okay, but probiotics are incredibly important. And I would urge patients to think of two species in particular, the Bifidarium species, Bifidarium infantis, and then the Lactobacillus family. And specifically within the Lactobacillus family, Lactobacillus helveticus, as well as Lactobacillus rhamnosus, and Lactobacillus foraminus. These are the major ones that studies have shown can have a positive impact on anxiety and depression. Now, interestingly, there's also a variety of species of bacteria that can end up in our gut that have been implicated in causing depression and causing anxiety. Faecalibacterium is one that's been implicated in severe depression. And then Campylobacter jejuni, as well as some Citrobacter species, have been implicated in anxiety. So all of this is leading us to a point where if someone is suffering a mood disorder or mismanagement of their stress levels, one of the first steps that we may want to start entertaining as this area of medicine really starts to explode is a stool culture or a stool analysis.
Okay.
And by recognizing what it is that grows in your gut, then we can start to make the changes. If there's species in there that we know are causative of anxiety or depression, then we have to come up with strategies to lower their percentage, at least, in the gut. And then, again, referencing the Bifidarium species and the Lactobacillus species that we've discussed, coming up with ways to augment them. That's where probiotics really are important.
Okay.
And I don't think a conversation about modulating the gut microbiota is complete without us also, at least briefly, mentioning fermented foods. Okay. Fermented foods are gaining a lot of traction, and rightfully so. If you look at older civilizations, whether you look at Korean civilization or you look at the Turkish civilization, you find that these civilizations are heavily invested in fermented foods like kimchi, sauerkraut, which is, by the way, German, kefir, which is a beverage. But I was researching Turkey because I'll be there in June, and there's at least a dozen traditional fermented foods that Turkish people eat on a regular basis. I'm hoping to learn a lot more about that when I'm there and bring some of that information back to the audience that I'm developing here in the US with regards to gut health. But the point being is that in addition to probiotics that you purchase at Trader Joe's or at Whole Foods, you've got to also include fermented foods like kimchi and sauerkraut. The final thing is that there's another agent that occupies a lot of real estate in the human gut, at least the modern human gut. And when I say modern human gut, I mean post-1950. Why I make that distinction is a whole new conversation that we can't get into today, but let's just, for the sake of our discussion, just apply when I refer to a modern gut as a post-1950 gut. But in that gut, there is a tremendous likelihood that there will be excessive levels of yeast, particularly one species called Candida. And I want you to think of the gut as really real estate. And it's very difficult for a newcomer to push somebody out before they can take up residence in that real estate, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that you have to do is you have to work with a doctor or work with a provider who understands gut dysbiosis, understands gut microbiota, and is able to help you not only add new healthy bacteria to your gut microbiota, but also help you eliminate Candida and other forms of yeast.
And I think one of the first ways to start lessening the yeast growth would be taking out sugars, correct?
Well, I think that taking out sugars is taking out what feeds the yeast, because yeast ferment. That's why we use them to make bread and beer.
Yeah.
But one of the really serious problems with the food supply that we have is that most of our meat is industrially raised, which means that it's not roaming on the earth. It's actually in huge concrete feed lots.
Yeah.
And that these animals are fed a feed that is laced with low levels of antibiotic. And that antibiotic ends up essentially being embedded in that animal. And when we're sourcing that animal for meat, we are inevitably, despite cooking it, despite doing whatever other measures we take, we are getting exposure to antibiotics. on a daily basis if you're a meat eater. What are the implications of that? Well, antibiotics kill bacteria, they don't kill yeast. So yeast, which has always been a rather minor character actor in the ecology of our gut microbiota, it has gained an unprecedented prominence since 1950, which is, by the way, one of the seminal events that happened right around then, is that animal feed began to include antibiotics. Okay. And so since then, we've been seeing this shifting of the gut microbiota away from some of the healthy bacteria species that we would like to have in our gut and more towards a yeast-centric, incredibly increased levels of candida in particular. And that needs to be eradicated in order for us to get back to Eden, get back to that sort of original gut microbiota.
So if we take out, at very least, if we take out processed meat, and if you have to have meat go organic, would that make a difference?
Taking out processed meat, if you are going to consume meat, to consume it as organic free-range meat, okay, which is antibiotic-free. Having a plant-based diet that feeds the right species of bacteria. The yeast, they want nothing to do with plant-based oligosaccharides. But bacteria do, and bacteria can make magical things out of them that are desperately needed by our body. So that would be a good thing. And then to your point, reducing the amount of free sugar, processed sugar, refined sugar in your diet by choking the food supply to the yeast is also another effective strategy. But it has to all be done kind of in a complete manner in order for you to get the results that you're hoping for.
Yeah. And we're not talking about eliminating fruits. Like that, the breakdown of the fruit for as far as the sugar goes is a natural way that the body can understand. And then when you throw in like a Snickers bar to it, the body's like, what am I doing with this?
Well, so let me just take that example and explore that a little bit. Our grandparents, they didn't have access to a Snickers bar.
Right.
If you ask them to eat the level of carbohydrate or sugar that's found in a Snicker bar, Grandpa would have to sit down with a bushel of apples. And he'd have to say to you, well, I'll see you tomorrow because I'll be here all day eating this, right?
Yep.
Well, what we've done by concentrating through the process of refining, and then around 1985, another seismic change occurred, which is that we introduced high fructose corn syrup as the primary sweetener in American foods. Coca-Cola, by the way, is the first company that did that. Everybody else followed, and now about 80 to 90% of the food in America contains high fructose corn syrup. And what that did is it put everything on steroids. So now literally a modern American can eat one Snicker bar and take in the same number of calories that Grandpa would have gotten from having eaten a bushel of apples. And you're absolutely right. The body doesn't know what to do with that because that's never happened. If you think about our microbiota, if you think about our gut bacteria, and by the way, we get them as gifts from our moms. So moms pass them on to their children. And you can actually trace genealogy by looking at mitochondrial DNA of the bacteria because you can identify, like in a graveyard, who was connected to who vis-a-vis your gut bacteria DNA.
Wow.
So mothers give this gift along with so many others, but they give this gift to their children. But throughout the millennia, as long as we were exposed just to natural sugar, in other words, sugar that was derived from a fruit or from a plant, there was just a certain level to which our gut bacteria had adjusted and evolved. And then out of the blue, literally for the bacteria, out of the blue, right about 1950 on, as we began to process our food, something else started coming down the pipeline. And that was sugar in unprecedented scale. And, you know, ecology and Darwinian notions of evolution are that creatures, big and small, they respond to their environment. Yeah. They will evolve, and certain species win and certain species lose based on changing environmental conditions. You think about the fact that at one time on this earth roamed dinosaurs, and today there are none.
Mm-hmm.
That's because as the environment changed, it could no longer support those animals, and those animals became extinct. New animals arrived. Believe it or not, you should always think of your gut in similar terms. This is a complex ecosystem. It's more complex and more biodiverse than the Amazonian rainforest. This is, by the way, actually truth. And it's such a complex ecosystem, and yet we have kind of, with a very cavalier attitude, made changes in our diet, in the amounts of antibiotics that we're exposed to, that have had profound impact on this ecosystem. It shouldn't surprise any of us that as a result, that ecosystem changed. The organisms that now are there weren't there 50, 60 years ago, and there's reasons for that that have everything to do with evolution.
Yeah. You have said so many amazing things that I think it brings a lot of hope to a lot of people that, dealing with depression does not have to be a lifelong struggle. Would you put PTSD in that category as well?
I would, because what PTSD does is it changes the way that our stress hormones behave.
Okay.
And so if a person is struggling with any of these issues, depression, anxiety, PTSD, psychic trauma, sexual trauma, there doesn't have to be one solution. And I always tell my patients, keep your eyes and your mind open to all possibilities. And the truth is out there for each of us. Each of us has an authentic way to heal ourselves. That may include some pharmaceuticals. It may include some diet. It may include exercise. It may include weight loss. There are a lot of things that can go into us coming to a better state of well-being. And certainly, the conversation that you and I are having today, I'm hopeful for your viewers, opens up another window in ways that they can start to think about their health, their mental well-being, and how that may be affected through manipulating the gut microbiota.
Yeah, yep. And throughout this summit, I've been hinting at or pointing to the foundation of our lives, which is us, doing self-care first. And then when we look inside of that, from this conversation, I've concluded that the foundation of the self-care is definitely in our gut health. And as soon as that we can start creating this wonderful foundation of a healthy gut, any other healing modality that you choose to go after has a better chance then than it would otherwise, because it's going to start to stick. You're going to start I don't know how you feel about the energetic fields and how things can sit in the body, but as soon as you feel better inside of your gut, it's like you can let go of that energy that's trapped. You can let go of the mental pains that get stuck in our minds just because we have a base. I noticed a lot of work that I've done throughout the years over this past decade that I come back and I look at, it's like, why am I angry? I don't even know sometimes. And I would not be surprised at all if it has anything to do with my gut health, considering the fact that I'm labeled celiac disease. I cannot have any sort of processed wheat. Now, I have found by eliminating it, I can have organic, very seldom and not a whole lot, but I was able to digest it, which was a win for me. Gives me a little bit of hope, but I know I still got a long ways to go as far as healing that.
Well, I certainly wish you the best of luck with that. And that, celiac disease, gluten intolerance, gluten sensitivity is a very modern problem. Most of modern civilization is derived from agrarian civilizations like the Egyptians and others that were entirely dependent on wheat.
Yeah.
And the idea that the modern the modern human gut would suddenly begin to reject something that was so essential for thousands of years to survival is disturbing.
Yeah.
And there's a whole different conversation you and I could have about my thoughts on that. But I would say to you that in addition to eating organic sources of wheat, try some ancient grains.
Okay.
One of the problems there's two problems with wheat, the modern version of it. One is that thanks to corporations like Monsanto, they've been genetically modified. There are species of wheat that now exist that have DNA added to them that come from fish.
That's weird.
And the reason is that there's a fish in Africa that can survive drought.
Okay.
And what it does is it burrows into the mud dries and encases it. That fish will remain dormant inside of that encased mud for a whole season or a whole year until the rains come back. And when it does, and the mud softens, this fish magically reemerges. Well, scientists discovered that there are certain genes that allow that fish to survive drought, to survive hypertonic solutions where there's a lot of salt and not enough water. And what did they do? They took that DNA and they grafted it into the DNA of wheat so that they could now raise wheat in extremely arid, drought-ridden areas of the world, ostensibly so they could feed more people. Well, when we begin to play God, I think that's when you open Pandora's box. And you may have the best of intentions, but you can't foresee some of the untoward consequences.
Well, yeah.
And that's what's happened with modern wheat, which is why a lot of people will use ancient grains. These are unadulterated, unmodified grains. They're hard to come by, but if you're able to come by them, you'll find that you will not have this reaction to them.
That's amazing. I mean, like, if we just even think of the ripple effect for a second, that they went and modified all this. Celiac disease is starting to show up, or the intolerance. And then from that, you can get other diseases and cancers because the body and the gut is not working properly.
Yeah.
So eat as raw as you can, organic as much as you can. Use a great mix between the medical field and going natural, and create a balance. That's pretty much what I've heard.
I think balance is just a good principle to follow always.
Yeah, definitely. So, well, thank you so much for being part of this summit. And I'd like to invite you and the audience to our Facebook group. It's Breakthrough and Thrive, Ignite Your Power, Take Charge of Your Healing, and Create Your Happiness. And inside of there, you can ask questions. And Dr. Jha, you can answer them if you'd like. I'm posting all the videos there.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much for being part of it. And to you, audience, thank you so much for being open-minded to your healing path and committed. And I love you lots. I'll see you all next time.
Okay.